Welcome, everybody, to Constellations Conversations with me, Robert Rowland Smith, and Nicola Dunn. Hello, Nicola.
Hi, Robert.
So we said we would try and tackle the subject of grief, healing, and recovery today, or the three subjects of grief, healing, and recovery, though, of course, they are interlinked. And we will, of course, talk about grief in relation to people who've died. But our definition, I think, will be a little bit broader to include the idea of grieving over things that have been lost in life, a phase of life, a job that's been lost, a relationship that's passed, and so on. So grief in the broadest sense, and how we heal from those moments of loss, periods of loss, and then how we recover from them. So I think, just to say at the beginning, we're taking a fairly broad definition of grief, healing, and recovery. Anything you'd sort of initially want to throw in, Nicola, with those three terms before we dive in?
Um, I just think that what we're talking about is a necessary evolution of life. And so when we talk about grief, there is this letting go in order for something new to come in, even if that's a space or an experience. And even though we may recoil a little at the concept of grief, it is something that we are likely all to experience in many different ways in our lives.
It is a necessary evolution, isn't it? And it makes me think of a couple of things. And obviously, with advances, particularly in the West, with medicine, people are living longer. And I remember I lived for not very long, couple of years in Los Angeles, where, of course, the pressure to prolong youth and sort of by association defer aging and death, it seems a really constant preoccupation, as though, almost as if, this is a bit of an exaggeration, death is viewed as an unfortunate illness or anomaly that, with enough medical research, could actually be obviated, or cancelled out entirely. And it actually reminds me, I think Freud makes an amazing remark at some point to the effect that death at some point will be removed from human experience. And then in turn, I was thinking of that myth which T.S. Eliot quotes in The Wasteland about the Sibyl who asks for eternal life but forgets to ask for eternal youth. And Eliot's The Wasteland opens with this horrific story of these boys going to visit this woman, the Sibyl, who has been alive now for hundreds of years and has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk until she's about this big and is held suspended like in a glass jar for people to come and gawp at her. So sort of pretty grim, pretty grim story. But at the same time, and I'm good friends and a sort of associate with a man called Andrew Scott, who's famous for writing this book, The 100-Year Life. And he's sort of associated with the research around the fact that in the West, now most people who are born into reasonable affluence will expect to live to at least 100 years. Although at the same time, we're conscious, particularly in the United States, I think, that life expectancy has plateaued and even gone backward because the advances in medical care have been overtaken really by poor lifestyle choices that lead to things like, obesity, obviously, and things like that. Sorry, that was a bit of a longer spiel than I meant it to be.
Yes, and I think also we need to note just that in terms of disadvantage and poverty, people don't have the resources or the privilege of the resources to do a lot of these things.
Exactly.
So just coming back to grief, and I understand that some people may have come across this accidentally and be really, really suffering from the loss of a partner, a parent, a child, a dear friend. And how I think for many people, the initial experience of loss is a hollowing out sense that the marrow in the bone has somehow been thinned within them because they have lost someone very, very dear to them. And I think that's something we maybe need to pause for a moment on. And, in our own practice in constellations, sometimes people will come with a proximity to a death, and there's probably a right moment for that. And people put particular lines down as to when is a good moment to come to a Constellations workshop. And I'm relatively fluid about that. And also, I think it's an individual case by case basis. But I did have a woman who came, her brother had taken his own life sort of 5 weeks before, but she was really keen to come because of what was happening to her family, which seemed to be torn apart by it. So I think sometimes constellations can help by providing this kind of larger view that something like that it's not just about the individual, it's a full family and multi-generationally held experience.
Yes, absolutely. And going back to what you said at the beginning, it is a necessary part of life. I mean, it is something we will all go through one way or another. That sense of hollowing out that you described, or the thinning of the marrow, which is a beautiful phrase. So it's not a question of whether, it's always a question of when.
When, exactly.
When it will happen. And I don't think it's something that you really can ever get better at, even if you've suffered several losses. It's the loss in loss remains a source of terrible sadness, no matter how many times it's experienced. I don't think one necessarily develops a sort of scar tissue around loss.
I think perhaps the heart is wider and there's more space for it. And maybe there is less struggle with the experience of it because you know the arc of it. But it is, it's a reflection of the space that the love for the person has held within you.
Yeah. You and I, Nicola, when we've taught together in the past, have sometimes done with our students exercises around death. I remember one we designed together called Meeting a Stranger. I don't know if you remember that, which was about inviting a representative and a representative for their death to meet one another. And what's striking to me, because I've used that motif in, as it were, everyday constellations with issue holders, is that I think it's pretty much the only trope in constellation or move in constellations which is universal, in the sense that the feeling is the same for everybody, that whenever I've run that constellation, the meeting your own death, and the trope is pretty much a movement from fear to acceptance, and then even a very calm mood of rightness that affects the person involved. And that death actually, when represented, is never scary. It's simply a welcoming, natural presence that waits until the time is right.
Yes. So I think for the individual who faces death, and that we all have a sell by date, I guess, a secret sell by date. And probably, fortunately, we don't know when that is. But I imagine when the moment comes, it's a very deep experience.
Yeah.
And I think we're talking here too about the loved ones who must loosen their grip as someone they care deeply about is moving towards that almost kind of sacramental experience.
Yes. And of course, when you set up in constellations the loved ones as well as the dead person and their death, it's often very healing for the issue holder to see that the deceased person, the person they grieve, is at peace.
Yes.
and has been, well received, as it were, into death.
Yes. And I think that's the concern, isn't it? The concern is around the perhaps a struggle or how it was for them, and to see that actually there is a resting into the arms of death. And then, of course, the grieving starts for those that are left.
Yeah.
And we've talked about it in terms of a dear one. And we've also considered it in terms of, and I would add to that, a sentient being. I think some people, however their lives are structured, have very, very deep relationships with uh, their, their animals, their dogs, their horses, that are a part of their lives. There is something very deep and healing that can happen between individuals and animals, sentient beings. And so that is often no less for an individual. But we're also talking about events, positions, what happens in supposedly retirement for people, whatever happens these days, that we have this desire to be deeply attached. And then we notice when something goes, and we're often surprised by the sort of roots that have extended and that we miss so dearly.
Yeah, exactly. Let's come on to that, but I'd like to go back again to your phrase right at the beginning, because it struck me so much, this sense of hollowing out. I mentioned Freud, and I'd like to just remind people of Freud's own work on grief. There's a paper he wrote called Mourning and Melancholia, where he obviously is linking mourning and sadness, melancholia. And to cut a long story short, what he says is that all melancholia, all sadness, is a result of what he calls incomplete mourning. In other words, there isn't enough hollowing out. And his metaphor for this is what is a digestive metaphor, that when somebody dies, we take them in, we kind of ingest them. And the process of mourning should be to ingest them until they've dissolved. But for a lot of people, they only half ingest them. And it's the residue of the living person within them, which is the origin of the melancholia. So the sadness that comes with grief relates to the incompleteness of the death of that person within us. And so long as they remain alive within us, there is a source of, or a potential source of melancholia or depression or sadness. And therefore, complete mourning involves, we talked about recovery, involves a letting go. It's when the person who is dead is no longer alive within us, but is then dead within us, and then we can move on. So we become a crypt, essentially, for that other person.
That's absolutely fascinating, Robert. And I was thinking about how it relates in constellations that, our primary relationships, for better, for worse, are with our parents. If we knew both of them or not, perhaps we knew one, but we didn't know the other. And I think perhaps grief is made even more difficult when that hasn't been an easy relationship. The tiny younger part of us that still hopes for some different type of relationship now realizes that the parent has passed, that isn't possible. And so sometimes there's a struggle. There's a struggle with the grief, exactly as you said, because in the constellation terms, we taken life from our parents, and if that has been very problematic, that journey will still continue even after their death.
That's right. And the kind of silent dialogue with the deceased continues as though it could be resolved in their absence.
Yes.
Of course, Constellations does allow us to use this word with caution, but Constellations does allow us, as it were, to resurrect the dead and have that conversation to a degree. But the healing typically consists in the representative for the dead person saying not only I'm fine here, I'm dead, or leave me be, but also in issuing a kind of blessing to the person who survives them. May your life go well, I smile on you. And that seems to be a kind of releasing move to make, I suppose.
Yes. Yes, I mean, there are these processes, aren't there, where we understand how transgenerational families work, and that sometimes, often to really harsh conditions, necessity, whether that is, as we've said before, poverty or war, the dead couldn't be fully grieved because there was such an imperative for survival that was necessary. So in a way, because ancestors perhaps weren't supported to grieve, the family survived, but there is still a sort of price to pay. And sometimes that is picked up by generations that come after. So they have this half-life where they are connected back either to an ancestor or sometimes to a sibling that has died that perhaps they weren't told about.
Mm.
And so we sort of see that interweaving between life and death, where grief really hasn't been supported and healing hasn't been able to happen.
Yeah. Can I come back to your phrase also, loved ones? To put it very crudely, we grieve people more if we've loved them more. The grief is worse the more we've loved them, essentially. I know it's a bit crude, but bear with me. And the reason I'm thinking of that is that in Derrida, Jacques Derrida, a French philosopher I love, in his reading of Freud, and in his other work on mourning, he's written quite a lot on mourning and the work of mourning. He says we all know right from the beginning that everybody else is going to die. And we know that every time we use somebody else's name, because we know at some level that the name is what survives that person. So as soon as somebody dies, we can use their name lives on. But the name lives on even before they die, according to Derrida, because we know it will. So there's already a kind of pre-apprehension, if you like, of everybody's death. And when we particularly love somebody, that's intensified, he says, more or less. In loving relationships, we know, again, at a very profound level, that we're going to lose them at some point. Either they'll survive us or we'll survive them. So, and, in the marriage service, or at least in our version of the marriage service, this phrase, till death do us part, is central. Like we're here together until death divides us. And so there is jeopardy in love relationships because the more we love somebody, the higher the price we know we're going to pay, or they will pay, when one of us dies. And therefore, to love somebody is really taking the risk of death in a way that, it's not like, jumping over the Grand Canyon or something. It's not sort of daredevil risk taking, but it's existential risk taking because we've allowed ourselves to be vulnerable to their loss. And the more we love them, the more it's going to hurt. So the vulnerability really increases with the love that we share with people that we do love. And grief is, in that sense, pre-wired into our loving relationships. We love people in the full knowledge that it will come to an end at some point and death will divide us.
Yes, and this is why different philosophies and we could say religions. I don't know if the Buddhists consider themselves a religion or a spiritual path, but focus on death for that reason, in the sense that it's unescapable. And I would say perhaps in our modern life, we do try to often outrun it.
Yeah.
They've become busier and busier and not actually live it on a daily basis. So grief and loss help us to understand life.
Yes.
And something about the preciousness of it.
Yeah, that's fantastically put. And of course, it also applies in more ordinary way. We know things will come to an end. And we said at the beginning of this episode that we'll talk about grief, not just in relation to the death of somebody, but also those phases, and you touched on this, of life that will naturally come to an end. We know that if we go to university, it will be for a few years and then it will come to an end and we'll move on. I had a client recently who was talking about, a period in his relationship with his wife that was very happy, but they knew it would come to an end because they'd been traveling and then they'd move back where they began, and there would be a moving on, a letting go that was necessary. And of course, in love relationships, I don't think most people at least, don't begin a love relationship with a time limit on it or a sell-by date, to use your phrase from earlier. We tend to think, I'm starting this in the belief, or at least the hope, that it'll last and maybe will be the last. But of course, any of us who've had relationships know that most relationships haven't made it that far. And so we are in a state of having to deal with unsuccessful relationships in the sense that they've finished. Maybe unsuccessful is a cruel way of putting it. They're just relationships that ended all the time. And all of us have a kind of back catalogue of not just love relationships, but friendships perhaps that have faded away, that we wouldn't have wanted to fade away, jobs that maybe we were asked to leave, or places that we had to move on from, where the ending was unwelcome.
Yes. And it's really interesting because those are often things that people might come to a constellation workshop about. Either they're aware of that ending, or something is just not quite right. And they're not quite sure what it is, what is in the way of this progression they want in their current life. And often it does come back to an unintegrated ending.
Yeah. I mean, it comes up a fair amount in relation to divorce and ex-partners, and we've touched on those a little bit before. But it's rare, well, I think it's never the case that an ex-partner has zero impact in a constellation. If you bring their representative in, there'll always be some impact that an ex will have in some way. It's not necessarily there's unfinished business, but if the ex is just roundly excluded from a constellation, that will have consequences. As we know, it's almost a golden rule of constellations, I suppose, that the excluded continue to have an impact on those who come after.
That raises a really interesting question, because sometimes briefer encounters that are physically intimate are included in constellations. And sometimes the how can I say, the impact is different for both parties.
Yeah.
Occasionally you will get a partner who comes in and it was perhaps very brief, as brief as it could possibly be. And they have a kind of wondering, why am I here? Why am I here? I don't know why I'm here, or I'm out of this. But they may still have been impactful. And that raises a whole interesting question for another time as to how impact in those situations gets created, and how something then becomes a relationship, becomes a partnership, as opposed to something that was more time limited.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating, really, because you're highlighting the fact that in relationships that come to an end, whether they're just sexual, or they're broader than that, or even kind of professional relationships, that there's always an asymmetry in some ways. It's experienced, or at least it's always experienced differently by the parties involved. I remember reading a book once, I think it was called Uncoupling or something like that, and talking about the end of relationships. And it made the point there's always a lever and a left. No matter how friendly the terms might have been on which people separated, actually, pure symmetry and 50-50 agreement is a fantasy. There's always a lever and a left. Now, in constellations work, we shouldn't fall into the trap of feeling that therefore it's always worse for the left person than the leaving person, because guilt can attach to the leaver, for example, just as sadness can attach to the left person. And indeed, the left person might be as much a perpetrator as a victim, and vice versa. So it's never straightforward. We should, in constellations, I think we're always very, very alert to judgment being dispensed one way or the other. You were wrong, he was right, kind of thing. It's never helpful.
It's wonderful in constellations because there are really no pro formas. And it is very delicate, almost, dare I say it, like neurosurgery. Not that anyone would want me doing neurosurgery on them, but this idea that actually there are these very fine kind of tendrils that need to be just opened up, and that, as you say, there is a certain, we're talking now about ending relationships. I suppose there is a verve that the person who calls it has when they call time on something, because they stop it regardless of what's happened. And I guess there is a certain responsibility that comes with that. But perhaps both benefit from it or whatever. So it's a very delicate process to be handled well. And as you say, with respect for both parties.
Mm. There's a sentence I sometimes use, maybe you use it too, in Constellations, for relationships that have ended. And the sentence is, whatever happened, you'll always have a place in my heart.
Mm-hmm.
And the point of that sentence is to say that even if things went awry, there was a point at which connection was made. And the acknowledgement of that is usually more helpful than pure denial or an adamant fundamentalist rejection of the person with whom one had the relationship. Because in most cases, at least, one will have played one's part or agreed to the relationship at some level at the beginning. So to exercise the right of complete disavowal isn't always a helpful thing to do in a constellation. In fact, keeps the left person or the leaving person more bound in that relationship and less free than they would otherwise be.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? So with partnerships, and we're talking about grief, there's this idea I have to cut the cord, get them out of me, end the process. And often it is more about finding and giving the right place to that relationship. It's not about extracting a bindweed. It's about it's more horticultural in the sense it's finding the right soil, the right place within your heart. So and then in the same way with a loss of not of that type of relationship, once again it is giving the right place so that there is a space for new life to happen, and one's not in denial about the grief and the loss, but one has gently done that movement, which may take some time. On the person who was in your living life, who's now become your ancestor, regardless of their age.
Just want to pick up on your bindweed metaphor and then hand back to you to finish, if you don't mind, Nicola, because we're more or less at time. But I do remember watching a gardening program once about bindweed. For non-horticultural viewers, bindweed is considered a sort of virulent pest in the garden because it grows everywhere and it's very hard to get out unless you absolutely dig it out from the very, very root. And it tends to keep coming back. But one of the features of bindweed is that it has a rather beautiful flower. I think it's part of the convolvulus family, a rather beautiful trumpet-like white flower. And in this particular gardening program, the ideology was, let it grow, but actually use the flowers and twirl them up. I mean, it was used to twirl up these iron railings, I think, and it was rather beautiful. So I think that's quite a nice image for what you're just building on what you're describing there, Nicola.
And also it gives this idea that actually in the whole process, there is a strength that is gained.
Exactly.
And the grief, the healing, the recovery, and it is a natural part of life. Even though it brings pain, it delivers a kind of a depth and a gravity and a compassion for those who remain.
Exactly.
So thank you to everyone who's been listening and watching. Please like, subscribe and share. We like that ourselves because that helps keep us motivated. And if you'd like to contact Robert, you can find him at robertrowlandsmith.com and myself at nicoladunnconstellations.com. Hope to see you again.